Sadaf have lived through disruptions. One could say by choice, by Emma going to Iraq to work there during the war. In Sadaf's case, by disruption being brought to Dhaka, to Bangladesh in the form particularly of the...
How about me?
I'm coming to you,
Lebanese.
Nassim. In the case of Bangladesh, of the Holy Bakery attack and other events. And I think that Nassim and Ha-Joon are both disruptors. So we're going to try and sort of have that as our opening.
The Lebanese would get upset. We had civil war. That was horrible.
That's true, actually. We could go back to that as well. But we've only got another 58 minutes. So as a starting point, we need to look at what it is that is causing the disruption. So what I'm going to do is just suggest one or two ideas and then go to each panelist in turn to say what they think is causing a world of disruption. Indeed, if they agree that we are living through abnormal times. So I guess that one of the things is globalization and the effect that has had on job security, particularly in richer countries, with the rise of Asia, parts of Africa, and this kind of changing of the economic hierarchy or the economic order, in a way returning it to something closer to what it was 300 years ago. We also have technological change, the sudden extraordinary power of companies like Google or Uber, these sort of aggregation companies that now potentially control our lives, combined with robotics potentially taking our jobs in more spheres than has ever happened before. And then we have other things like particular events in particular countries, perhaps combining with Islamist terror as a global revolutionary force, which has been extraordinarily influential, indeed in parts of the world where it might not have been anticipated. Let's say Belgium, for example, generating jihadist terror out of Belgium. So those are some of the things. I guess we could possibly drop in global warming and the sense of anticipation and even fear that people have, that again, the security that earlier generations would have had, namely that they'd be able to breathe the air and drink the water, that kind of security is starting to evaporate. So I'm going to go to Ha-Joon Chang first and just say, what do you think is causing the present global disruptions?
Well, in a way, you alluded to this, but history of capitalism has always been disruptive. It has always created new technologies that destroy jobs. It have dislocated people. It led to imperialism and colonization. So actually, in a way, this period is not an exception. The exceptional period was the period between the end of the Second World War and, say, 1970s, when, at least in the rich countries, they created this system of stable jobs, welfare state, and robust economic growth, which created this sense that this is normal. But actually, we've seen the end of that period, and now we have entered a new stage where, as you mentioned, global borders are opened up, and overall, I believe that globalization is in the long run a positive force, but the trouble is that destroys people's lives and jobs, and
in the process.
In the process, and it's even if you can say that, well, if you have grown at like 8% for 20 years, like India has recently done, or Korea did in the 60s and 70s, everyone's better off, but in the process, a lot of people have been sacrificed. And I think the most dangerous thing at the moment is that, the American writer Go Vidal once said that the American economic system is free enterprise for the poor and socialism for the rich. The global rich class have created this system in which they are protected from the market forces.
They are protected.
The American CEOs signed this contract where they'll get $50 million if they fail.
If they fail,
banks that are bailed out by taxpayers' money. So this is creating the resentment, and I think this is the most dangerous thing at the moment.
Thank you so much. So I'm now going to turn to you, Emma Skye. Do you agree with that argument that in a way the abnormal period was post-Second World War, when there was a kind of a degree of liberal consensus, a degree of optimism about what humanity might do? People came up with ideas like modernization theory, which in retrospect seems perhaps unduly optimistic.
Well, I think we are witnessing the end of the post-Cold War period. Remember at sort of 1991, when this was declared the end of history, that liberal democracy was the future. This was the only way to see the world. And I think that is the period that I came of age in that period. I remember as a kid at school, we used to talk, is it going to be the end of the world? Always worried about nuclear war. But as an adult, that was never part of the conversation.
Right.
Grew up in this period where nuclear war, existential threat, was taken off the agenda. So it was this post-Cold War period, and that was supposed to be the future, the liberal world order led by the United States. The major disruptor to that order was actually the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, not 9/11 itself, but the 2003 war as the US overreaction to what happened on 9/11. And I think the impact of the Iraq war, you can draw a line between Trump's inauguration later today and the Iraq war.
Were you aware when you were in Iraq in that period that this was on the horizon? Did you feel at the beginning this is going badly wrong?
Yes, I mean, I went out to Iraq in 2003 with the coalition. I was never a believer in the war, but I wanted to do my bit to help the Iraqis rebuild their country. At the stage, it was very, very clear when I ended up just by chance being told I was now governing a province. So it was clear there was no plan for the aftermath of the war. But when you're there and you're focused on day-to-day issues, it's hard to see that in any perspective. If you'd told me that the Iraq war would end up bringing about civil war inside Iraq, would change the balance of power in the region in Iran's favor, would create the ungoverned spaces that would lead to ISIS, I couldn't see any of that back in 2003.
Right.
And when you look and see what it has done in terms of the unraveling of the Middle East, the meltdown of the European Union under the influx of refugees coming from the Middle East, and the end of Pax Americana that had upheld world order since the end of the Second World War.
Thank you so much. Sadaf, Saaz, if I can ask you now, what is causing the world of disruptions that we're now living in the era of Donald Trump being on the verge of becoming US president in about 10 hours' time?
I think the interesting thing is bringing an example of somewhere like Bangladesh. Fought for its independence after very horrific atrocities and coming out of the war, being written off essentially by American Kissinger as a basket case, and basically forging its own way for the last 45 years. Coming to the stage where we have 7% growth, we export, we're the second largest exporters of garments in the world, and at the same time, I think we're leading the world in leading South Asia in addressing gender equity. But against this backdrop, there's been another sinister connection between the local and the global. In that, yes, sort of economically, I think more women are working outside the home and getting empowerment in real terms. But from our history, there has been some intensely local ramifications of our war, where local politics and links to Islamic extremists have connected with a kind of global movement of sort of Saudification of Islam that is linking to us, and this connection, I think, is extremely troubling as well.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn to Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Do you accept that we're living in a world of disruptions, or do you think the terminology is wrong?
Okay, so I pretty much disagree with these interpretations. They are sort of ad hoc, geopolitical or capitalism like that. My profession is someone who studies extreme events and deviations and systems that can deliver these extreme deviations. So let's go to nature. Let's do some science here. If I take an island, an isolated island, and count the species per square mile, we will find that an island will have many, many more species than a continent. Okay? And if you open up islands, merge them together, you'd have more species, okay, but the number of species per square mile would drop. Okay, that's an effect that is the property of systems, how they interact together. So now what have happened with globalization, nobody realized that globalization will produce the same thing in economic life, in cultural life. So let's focus on cultural life. To take an example, actually, this was in a Black Swan, so, and I received my copy exactly 10 years ago, okay, in my hands. So let's talk about how I described it then. I called it then the Harry Potter effect, winner-take-all effects resulting from globalization. In 1925, imagine being a writer in 1925 and you write in Serbo-Croatian. You're going to have an audience. Today, 90 years later, no audience. Why? Because of winner-take-all effects. Harry Potter, okay, was sold in Pakistan. In 1900, that would have never happened. Okay, each one local. So you move from a localism, a local economy, a local cultural life to something global. Now that will have huge effects. Concentration. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just I mean, one thought is that, you know, Calcutta at the end of the 18th century was generating more books than almost any other city in the world. So presumably there would, you know, under the sort of arguments of print capitalism, have been the distribution of the Harry Potters of the time.
Okay, so no, but if you take the number of languages, for example, it's like number of species. They're dropping the books. We have more languages, but we have complete concentration. Now let me translate to economic life, since we're short of time. In economic life, the fact that Harry Potter is delivering to my bedroom here in Jaipur, that Google is delivering a service in Jaipur, a company that went from college dorms to delivering services at the opposite end of the planet within like months, is something unheard of in history. But at the same time as Google replaced Alta Vista, you're going to have the route from Google to college dorms will also be short, unless government propped it up. So basically, it's a reaction against a scenery that has never been, we've never been into in history. So typically, and we have had cases in ecology where this happens, where you start to have monoculture, and eventually it completely destroys the whole scenery. So the system is not sustainable as it is. Now what happens is we have a bunch of corporate vultures who promote globalization as if it were something good, okay? But in fact, it is not something necessarily good, and it's not good for everybody. It's good for the corporation, it's good for Google, it's good for the author of Harry Potter. I myself benefited from it. I sold a lot of books. I wouldn't have, in 1900, I wouldn't have sold books at the opposite end of the world at the time. Okay, I would have sold maybe 22 books in Lebanon, and that was, or maybe 2,000 books in Lebanon, and that was it. So I benefited from it, okay, having a bestseller. But I tell you, it's unfair, and the system is a system like that. Now, from an extreme value theory standpoint, a system like that collapses completely by delivering something large. So it's better to constrain it now than let it constrain itself by itself later, as what we saw in 2007.
Thanks very much. I want to ask you, Sadaf, something, just to take the disruption more back to the political level, and particularly the arrival of Donald Trump. One of the things I've noticed anecdotally is that people in America seem often to be more shocked by the arrival of Trump than people in other countries. I mean, in a sense, he's the kind of leader, the kind of strongman who in many parts of the world is a fairly familiar figure, whereas to an American, particularly a Democrat voting American, he's a shocking figure. Looking at it again from the point of view of, if you like, South Asia or the rest of the world, how do you take it? Are you terrified by it, or do you think, well, it's just one of those things, that things come and go, leaders come and go?
No, I am terrified by it, and I think I was surprised at how personally it has affected me. As a South Asian and as a woman, I think that somebody who's admitted, a self-admitted sexual predator and
I mean, you could look at someone like Berlusconi and say it's not that different, is it?
I think we have this idea of America in our heads, a belief in the leader of the free world being something to aspire to, or the idea of America. I mean, we all have, the kaleidoscope of criticisms. And the other thing I think which has been very worrying is that we've always thought, or at least I've always thought, that the American institutions would be able to stand up to a figure like this.
Right.
And,
Yes.
and it doesn't seem to be. Let's see how it plays out.
No, that point about institutions is important. I mean, whether or not the institutions can constrain a figure in the United States, or whether in fact those institutions depend on goodwill and convention, which might now be in the process of being shot to pieces. But I just want to try to sort of link this, Emma, into your own experience. I noticed reading your book that there were a lot of American figures from the US Army or from private security firms who seemed somehow, even though the book is obviously set a few years back, they seemed a bit like Trump voters. So again, do you think that the way that the Trump victory looks to, let's say, readers of the New York Times is more shocking than it is to people who have lived with some of the realities of the people who have put Donald Trump into power?
I mean, yes, I do know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, and it's important to understand why. Because if you're liberal and you look at him, you think, oh my God, the man is just an abomination, and that's all you see. And people take his words very literally. And you can look at others, it's not so, they're taking him seriously, but not literally. And to understand that difference, I think, is important. A lot of people are voting not for Donald Trump himself, they're voting against the status quo. And Hillary Clinton was seen very much a continuation of the status quo. And people feel that their country is changing. America is changing, and it's changing quite rapidly. The color of America is changing, the ethnicity is changing, and there's a whole segment of the population that feels that they're losing their country, that they're losing their jobs. And they will complain that the government has done nothing for them. While the government focuses on microaggressions and choose your own gender bathrooms, and they're worried that their jobs are going. Well, their jobs are going more to do with technology coming in than immigrants taking their jobs. The robots are coming. So there is that fear, and it's important to understand that fear because it's real, and we need policies that deal with their real concerns. I have to say, I teach at Yale, and my students were beyond depressed. They were weeping, they couldn't go to classes. Their America was just, Trump is not their America. So you get these two very, very different views, both sides very passionately.
So before we just move on to economics, Ha-Joon, I just want to go back to Nassim and ask you, in a way, what you prophesy, the significance of black swan events, the idea that there is going to be continual disruption and change, what you think is on the horizon is probably wrong. Do you feel that that is coming true now in a way that is not surprising to you, given what you said?
I think that what we have here in the system is not a disruption. It's a system putting brakes on itself. Because if you look at Donald Trump, remove the fact that he's not running for Archbishop, right? So if you take that out, you look at policies, they're not that divergent from the past. They just put brakes on some things, move more jobs. It's not a big deal. So you can think that Donald Trump is probably a mechanism to preserve a system rather than a mechanism to disrupt it. Because if you're going to really disrupt the system, okay, you wouldn't have Donald Trump. You'd have something vastly more radical and would come from the left, and the real left, not that pseudo left, the real left, the localist left. You see them already in the States. Buy local, buy your cheese locally, grow your own vegetable, that kind of left, okay? And so Donald Trump is probably an attempt by the system to fix itself from within with some minor cosmetic changes. Again, don't read the New York Times and imagine that he's not running for Archbishop. If you remove these things, you realize that what he's proposing is not too different from his predecessors.
So you're suggesting it's a kind of self-correcting mechanism in the form of
It's a slightly correcting mechanism that may not be actually sufficient. Because a big danger doesn't come from Trump and stuff. The big danger is I would say, Monsanto-type corporations command so much power now compared to the past, and command so much of the press. They own the press, and that kind of thing. And militarism. Can you imagine someone 10 years ago being explained that the left, what we call the left today, will be militaristic?
Right.
So in support of fighting Russia and helping Saudi Arabia annihilate Yemen, I mean, that kind of left. So you can imagine that the big corporation has so much more control over the discourse to play with it like a violin. So this is a bothersome fact. So Trump, I think, it's a mild correction, but it's not going to change much in the long run. The system is going to destroy itself.
So Ha-Joon, do you want to take up that point on corporations and the power of corporations compared to how it might have been envisaged in the past? And maybe also as a kind of parallel question, a lot of what you write challenges all sorts of ideas that people take for granted, often without thinking about them very deeply. So when you say things like what is good for General Motors is not necessarily good for the United States, or you say that the whole principle of macroeconomic benefit may not kind of play through the system in the way that people assume that it will, or there is no such thing as a free market. Maybe you can just expand on that a little.
No, I've said a lot of outrageous things, but the first point to start is I very much agree with Nassim, but Trump says these things, but in economic terms, I think his impact will be very limited because the U.S. is bound by the international trade agreement, investment agreement. Of course, these agreements that have to be interpreted and implemented, so you can push it to the protectionist direction. But the system is already set in such a way that I think he's going to disappoint people. And then what? Because despite this 20, 30 years of sales pitch for globalization, a lot of people have lost out, and these people are angry. So I think unless you address that question, it's not going to go away. Now, in this picture, I think the rise of corporations is the biggest challenge because especially with these international trade agreements like NAFTA or say CETA, the one between Canada and the European Union. You have installed this mechanism in which the corporations can directly challenge government legislations in the kind of on the excuse that it has reduced our profit. This is a very thin ground, but then this is leaping over the national courts. This is taken directly to this dispute settlement panel made up of 3 lawyers, mainly based in Washington. That they have, of course, this panel wouldn't necessarily always rule in the favor of the corporations, but they have now that mechanism to even constrain governments. And when they keep expanding this power, of course, some people will benefit, but a lot of people will get hurt and then get angry. And as some people say, the greatest danger of our time might be these people who want to push globalization at the speed that the society cannot take. This is a point that the kind of the eminent Hungarian sociologist and economist Karl Polanyi made 7 decades ago in his book, The Great Transformation.
Absolutely. Polanyi is coming back. Yeah. Okay, so do you want to make a quick comment on that?
Yeah, no, so there's one other point that we have never seen before in history, ever, is people getting rich without taking risks. That we never had in history, what are called no skin in the game people. At no point in history, and that started about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when the head of a corporation is supposed to be a person on a salary. And they started paying themselves an outrageous amount of money, all right? They're no entrepreneurs. So that's one. And people understand that in India. You associate being rich in India with political patronage and rent seeking, all right?
Yeah, rent seeking is quite popular.
The same thing happened in the US. People start associating that class. People have respect for entrepreneurs but no respect for inequality coming from that class of salary people, GM employees, and they use crony capitalism, which is socialism for the rich. So that is something, you can say something to an American, you can make them buy anything, but that they cannot possibly buy.
Okay. So I'm going to cross back a little now to geopolitics. Emma, you said that you thought that Pax Americana is coming to an end. Do you want to project forward a little bit and say what you think is going to be next? Is it a multipolar world where all sorts of global norms that have functioned, arguably since the beginning of the 19th century or since at least since the Second World War, are going to be shot to pieces? Is this about the rise of China, that much heralded subject? And also, perhaps you'd like to just touch on what you think is going to happen in West Asia, the Middle East, the region that you've worked in, given that Islamic State is slightly on the back foot, but still expanding globally in terms of terror attacks.
So that's a small little question. Right. Yes, I do think it is the end of that era that we called Pax Americana. America's the unipolar power. I think that is something that former President Obama, felt himself. He was talking in that language in terms of a multipolar world. I think his hope was to create international norms that were strong enough for all countries to play along nicely together as we go into this multipolar world. Projecting how this is going to work is, I think, quite difficult. At this stage, there is so much that is unknown. We've had all this rhetoric through the campaign, and President Trump is not somebody who's going to be held to comments that he made during the campaign. So there is plenty of international agreements that the US has signed up to. Some people look at the Paris Accords and think maybe that's a new type of international diplomacy. So not a top-down, but a bottom-up. I mean, America is still a very strong economy. When people look at visas, which country would they like to get a visa to, they're not queuing up to go to Russia, they're not queuing up to go to China. It's still America. So America is not finished yet. America, you could say, is in relative decline because other countries are rising so strongly. Some in the Obama administration will say, look, that's an indication of the success of America, that it's helped these other countries develop and move forward. So going towards the Middle East, I mean, you can look and see most regions of the world are progressing. Most regions, the indicators are positive indicators. It's only the Middle East that is still struggling. And the struggle that is going through, I think, when the Arab Spring broke out, people were like, oh, at last, the Arab world missed out on the third and fourth waves of democracy, maybe it's coming now. It's going to be a long struggle in the Middle East. These revolutions are happening at a very difficult time. It's the information era. It's an era where liberal democracy doesn't look that great anymore. It's an area which has never had positive relations really with the West. So you've got all these internal dynamics going on. But at the end of the day, when you talk to young people in the Middle East, the world that they'd like to live in is one that looks like Dubai. It doesn't look like ISIS. So ISIS doesn't provide a vision for the future. It's taking advantage of the failures of Arab regimes. It's taking advantage of the shift in power in the Middle East in Iran's favor thanks to the Iraq War. It's taking advantage of the failed spaces, collapsing states, advantage of all of these things. But the grievances that led to ISIS are not being dealt with. So this iteration of ISIS, yes, is on the back foot. There will be other movements that come that way. But the future in that region is with the youth. And we have to hope and to help them get to a better place.
Thank you. So I think in about 5 minutes or so, we'll take reactions from you, the audience, but just a couple more things. So one is, Sadaf, sort of sticking with the theme of globalization, I want you to talk a little bit just about the fact that, I mean, you're directly involved, if you like, in, through garment export businesses, with this whole idea of globalization and how it feeds through. And yet, as we mentioned at the beginning, in the case of Bangladesh, you've got the blowback really from quite different countries, sending terrorists to, I mean, okay, they may be of Bangladeshi origin, but the ideas are being imported. I mean, do you think there's any possible turning back of the clock, or do you just think this is how it is? We have to deal with the fact that globalization is unchanging, that it's here to stay?
It's definitely here to stay, and picking up something that Emma and the others have mentioned, this idea of a huge group of people feeling they don't have access to resources, they don't feel heard, and they're being left behind, and we really have to deal with that. There are a lot, Bangladesh, for example, has a huge youth population which needs to be skilled, which needs access to jobs, which can ride on the energy and the opportunities ahead. But I think where you have extremist ideologies and forces being able to capture the imagination of some of these young people, it's more than ever important to, and these forces then are a threat to freedom of expression and creativity and all the things that I think that need to capture the imagination of the youth.
And what about the global supply chain?
Well, I think that even when you're looking at the global supply chain, for example, Bangladesh is benefiting, but at the same time it's right at the bottom rung of the ladder of the entire global supply chain. So even those who are doing well in Bangladesh also themselves don't have a lot of say in access. So I think that is something that has to be redressed at different levels
Sorry,
as
don't
well.
have a lot of say in how that system functions.
Exactly, yeah.
Interesting. So Nassim, do you want to respond to some of these, and maybe just also take up at the end the question of what is the next disruption? I mean, you have a remarkable track record of projecting forward.
No, I actually, the ISIS thing is a big thing for me.
Okay.
For one reason, because let's use some logical reasoning. If I grew up as a Christian in Lebanon, and as a Christian, you have sort of a detector built into you over 1,300 years, so you can see a fundamentalist just crossing the street, all right? You can detect that there's something about it. You immediately have, some tension in the back of your neck. There's something going on, all right? Luckily, there's nobody here. So anyway, and if I told you in 1975, all right, that we, the Christian of the area, we were, we thought that people would become secular, so would be part of the same society, okay? As, in Lebanon and within the other countries in the area. So we thought that there was going to be a movement by which religion would become something you do at home, okay? Not the point of secularization as much as a mechanism of tolerance where you have a separation of church and state, because that's what it is, it's a separation. Islam does not have a mechanism of separation of church and state built in because it is law, It's a law. It's not like Judaism started as law. So we thought that. So if I told someone in 1974, 50 years from now, you're going to have people chopping heads, Christians are going to, whatever, they're going to grab them and either chop their head or put them in chains and stuff like that. So you go back to that society, people say you don't understand history, okay? So either we don't understand history, or the history we understand, that linear progression towards a betterment, more secularism, more democracy, all that nonsense, okay, is not how history happens, okay? So if you continue that reasoning, you would realize that we failed, in understanding the evolution of history. We're not going to be, harmed again by the environment. So we're safe because we're moving west and we're reconnecting with our ancient Western roots. But look at the area, I think that ISIS is more like the norm. And I tell you frankly, ISIS is the norm. I went to Tripoli recently. I remove my cross when I go to a place like that. Go to Tripoli, you feel that there is something in some communities that are just willing to radicalize. So I think that, if anything, ISIS will take over Saudi Arabia because the government isn't compatible with them. I think that's the tendency. The tendency is more like, you have to work with that notion that given pogroms of Christians have started to occur in Egypt at an alarming pace, and they're the same people, right? You have to realize that ISIS is more like the norm, Islamic Brotherhood is more like the norm, and you have to live with that expectation. I hope to be wrong. So next step, I think that nobody would have forecast. Think about it. We have a state with 6 to 9 million people in it, okay, between Syria and Iraq. That state, I think they've shelled it 18,000 times. Nothing happening, with things still growing, all right? They claim it's not growing, but it's still growing. They can't really displace them from Mosul. So really there's something, if it spreads to Saudi Arabia, think of that state now becoming a state of 30, 40 million people, okay? So think of that. So I think the dream of Dubai is nice on paper, but actually in Dubai, go to Dubai and try to mix with the locals.
Impossible,
and
I've tried.
All right. Sorry?
It's impossible.
Yeah, no, but listen to the locals, okay? Listen to the locals, and you realize that ISIS is something that's perfectly normal for them. The locals, some of the locals, that 55% of the population of Dubai is Salafi.
And I'd like to ask the other panelists as well to just briefly take on this question of what disruption comes next. In other words, what is your sort of 30-second forecast before we hear reactions from the audience? Sadaf.
I think the war against extremist Islamists, I think that's, or extremists, I would say, they call themselves Islamists. But in the long run, climate change.
Climate change, okay. Emma?
Well, as climate change is already gone, I'm going to quote a colleague of mine at Yale who says, fragile masculinity.
Yeah, no, similar theme. I would say that angry people, angry people. No, I mean, ultimately, when the people do not accept the system, but do not have an alternative vision, it's going to create a lot of results that are totally unpredictable.
But sorry, just a counter question. I mean, do you not think there are also a lot of apathetic people, and that part of the disruption is not coming from anger, but from political apathy, particularly in the US context?
No, but a lot of apathy also comes ultimately from anger. I mean, you are so fed up with the system, you say, no, I'm not going to be part of it. And I mean, that's in a way that even more dangerous, because if someone's actively angry, you can at least try to engage with that person. But if you disengage and then suddenly, I mean, when something happens, you start coming out and voting for Donald Trump, or go on some media campaign against some, I don't know, political activists, that's even more dangerous.
I mean, I think there hasn't really been a roadmap for sort of a post-industrial pathway.
Yeah. Okay, so let's have some questions from the audience now. We might group them together. Because of the lighting, I can't really see anybody, so I might just ask the people from Teamwork who have the microphones to try and ideally alternate between men and women questioners so that we don't have any hint of fragile masculinity. Were you alluding to Donald J. Trump on the subject of fragile masculinity, Emma?
Not just him.
Yes, sorry. Can I start? Yeah. So Theresa May at Davos has said that corporations should start sharing their wealth. So do you think actions like this from governments is going to be do anything to mitigate the effects of globalizations and big corporations? And is it even any good?
Thank you. Let's have another couple of questions.
Hi, thanks for this. What you've seen over the past 2 decades, as Professor Taleb spoke about, is that there's been a great rise in crony capitalism. What I definitely see from whatever I have read is that you're going to have a lot more automation coming in. One example would be the carrier deal that Trump recently struck, which the money they use for further automation, right? So what definitely seems to be happening is there's going to be a huge loss of jobs happening due to a lot of automation that's going to be happening in the next few decades, right? And you might have read that Finland is experimenting with universal basic income. How do you see this playing out as a disruption? Because when people start losing jobs in masses, because capitalism doesn't really care about people's emotions, right?
Okay, thank you very much. Let's have one more.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So my question is, why do people like New York Times fail to see the upcoming result? Well, until the last day, they kept saying it is 90% in favor of Hillary Clinton and 10% probably for Trump. To me, the rise of Donald Trump is the Arab Spring of America without the violence. They simply voted against in the anger, against the excessive political correctness, and really some people being left behind.
Okay, let's have one last question on the world of disruptions.
Hi. So everybody here spoke a lot about what the next disruption will be, but my question is, what do we hope towards?
What do we hope? What do we hope towards?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Sorry, we're getting a fifth question, are we? Yeah.
This is for Mr. Taleb. You said that you don't really see Donald Trump as the threat. You see companies like Monsanto and big corporations as the real threat as globalization progresses. But I mean, people voting in people like Donald Trump or Modi in this country, those are big pro-corporate symbols of corporate growth. Why do people seem to hate corporate but then also seem to vote for it?
Thank you. Okay, so just to quickly recap on the 5 questions, and I'll ask the panelists to take whichever 1 or 2 or 3 appeal to you. One is about I think the idea of corporations being obliged to share wealth more widely. The second is about crony capitalism and how it'll play out, I guess connecting to the first. The third again gave the unfortunate NYT, a great newspaper, another hit. Why didn't it see that Hillary was going to lose? The fourth question was about hope, and the fifth was whether or not people like Donald Trump or Narendra Modi are pro-corporate. There is an argument that Mr. Modi is comparatively pro-socialist in some of his policies, but we'll perhaps leave that for another session. Who would like to answer first?
Yeah, I'll take the first question. No, I don't know exactly what Theresa May said, but I think the most important thing that corporations have to do is to pay taxes. So we first have to abolish all these tax havens, which is actually the easiest thing you can do. I mean, these tax havens are not the Himalaya mountains. They exist only because rich and powerful people want them to exist. So if there's political will, it's the easiest thing to get rid of. I mean, and then you have to do something about the power of the financial market, because the financial market has become far too powerful, and it has basically made corporations very short-term oriented. Unless you produce a result within 6 months, maximum 1 year, they are going to demand your resignation. So that even if they are relatively well-intentioned, these corporate managers have to deliver short-term profit. The easiest way of doing that is make working conditions and wages worse and not invest. The company might get into trouble 5-10 years later, but do you care? Because you are going to be doing something else, and you have signed a contract that guarantees you $50 million pension pot even if you failed in the venture. So you have to do something about the financial market. Unfortunately, when people talk about corporations doing more to share out, all they think is that donating little money to some school in the poor areas and that kind of thing. That's not going to be enough.
I wanted to just add on your point there about, I think, what you can make corporations do and not do, and this idea that in the long, the way that you perform has to be very short term. So linking to the point about polls and the media, even though we have a lot of information and internet is supposed to make information freely available, I think transparency in real terms, where actually how are corporations dealing with things, what kind of contracts are they getting into the global supply chain, for example. There's so much more that needs to be done to actually get proper information and transparency out there, and then and really reflect what is going on, I think.
What is there to hope for? I think there's a lot to hope for. What makes me optimistic is really the young generation. This is my first time to India, and when I arrived in Delhi, I was asked to come and speak to a class of young women all studying MBAs. They were absolutely adamant about wanting to be financially independent. They had courage, they had aspirations, they wanted to marry later, they wanted to have children later. I then went off to Ranthambore in search of a tiger. I didn't find a tiger, but my ranger was a young woman who again knew the park like the back of her hand, was very competent. We saw the tiger's footprints, even though we didn't get to see the tiger. So when I look around the world, I see young people who are more interconnected than ever, more access to education, better healthcare. They are the future, and that's what gives me hope.
Okay, no, I forgot one thing when you asked me about what's going to be disrupted. It's, I think, the educational system in the West and America. And as we know from Ha-Joon mentioned it in his work, that pretty much we know that education is an ornament because it doesn't increase GDP beyond a certain level. And particularly when places like Yale, you pay them $60,000 and this endemic to teach you classes on toxic masculinity, on a kind of nonsense. So this is pretty much what's happening. Yeah, it's the end of it. So it's been Uberized away from it. I have my own little institute where and I realize how easy it is to Uberize things, and education will be Uberized, it becomes certification. And that world of educators living in some kind, that never happened before, living in their own power, and pretty much in sort of like cahoot with real estate developers to try to, you know, and that's the university system creating several $1 trillion of debt. So that's going to collapse.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more round of audience questions. I mean, I loved your response, Emma, and I was glad also that you represented an aspect of women in India which often gets lost in reporting on India around the world, that is the reality, that it's not this kind of mono version of what women in India do and can do or expect for their own futures. Another thought was in reference to the question about Theresa May and the idea that tax havens should be challenged and so on. I mean, the extraordinary thing about that is that most of them are operating sort of via the City of London. You look at the global tax havens, they tend to be constructed out of the remnants of the British Empire and then be functioning through London. So, I mean, it did seem an odd thing to attack, given that she's the UK Prime Minister. Okay, so let's have some more audience questions, please. Teamwork.
Yeah, hi. My question is directed at Mr. Taleb. So you were talking about the real left that will be like, you know, the answer for all the questions which we are facing, like maybe Trump. But my question is like, where are they? Like, or if they exist, how do they, like, you know, take over the world? So, I mean, maybe strategies.
All right, thank you. And the next question?
My question is to Professor Taleb too. What do you think of tech companies like Google and Apple hosting a lot of personal information of like a lot of users, and how do you think that will play out as a disruption?
Thank you. Another one?
Hello, thanks. It's very interesting listening to all this. I wondered if you could give us your insights on universal basic incomes as something for the future.
Thank you. One more?
Hi, yeah. So we got a very dystopic view of the future. On one hand, we have ISIS shooting at us, and on the other hand, we have floods powered by climate change. So what can we do as citizens to mobilize the government to change this future, or to prevent ourselves, to save ourselves from this dystopic future?
Thanks, that's great. 4 very swift questions. So 2 of them are heading for you, Nassim. One on the real left, what it's likely to be able to do. Second on tech companies holding so much of our personal information. Then a question about universal basic income, which has been sort of knocking around for decades, but is now increasingly popular, challenged by people who think that it's actually damaging because it gives people, or rather doesn't give people the pleasure of going out to work and doing a day's work. And then finally a question on dystopia. What do we do?
Okay, I will start with what I call the real left. Actually, left and right was something that became obsolete the minute it was invented during the Constitutional Assembly of 1789, I think, or 91. All right, so left and right, you have to be careful. I think that people who are anti-militarism, who are for decentralization, for localism, for lack of central government, because centralized government, like Obamism, okay, attracts lobbyists, you see, whereas decentralized government is much harder to lobby for. That left, I mean, you can see, for example, Ron Paul as representative of that left. Less interference. They're neutral, but to me, they're more representative of that growing, environment, and the libertarians. That's the first question. Second one, universal basic income. I think it's something that people don't know really came from both libertarians and from Milton Friedman, who invented it. Sorry? And the whole idea is to do away with welfare by saying we don't want welfare. And I think it's wonderful because I think that the mechanism of welfare, the way it's managed in Washington, is mostly welfare for its employees. Okay? It costs us a lot of money. Just like NGOs are good for ego and also for employees. So I think in favor, it'll be resisted, of course. Why? Because just like solar is being resisted because utilities don't like solar, we're going to have resistance by the lobbyists against universal income.
And do you want to touch on the thing of personal information being held by tech companies?
Every morning you wake up, tell yourself, anyone who's not an artisan and delivering goods to you is your enemy. Your artisan, your butcher, your baker, so on, is not your enemy. A large corporation is separated morally from you. An artisan is not. So work on that principle. And of course, if Google could sell your eyeballs, they would, okay? And therefore, then the other problem is Google is now that Obama's gone, Google was penetrating Washington. And that's the dangerous part. The dangerous part is when corporations penetrate the government to prevent their descent, to prevent that cycle from taking place. So, I mean, I would love Google to go bankrupt, and it's going to be good for everyone.
Sadaf, would you like to respond?
I think with regards to a universal income, it's really important to, more than that, to have access to opportunity, level the playing field. And I think that's where a lot of young people, all of us as citizens, can come in and educate ourselves. We need to get beyond the post-truth phenomenon that we're facing now and use tools like social media or whatever else we have at hand to come together as communities, virtual and non-virtual, to I think fight the system.
And what do you think of the idea of a universal basic income?
I think that it's a very complex situation, and I would say it's much better to sort of look at stuff in the local way and give people access to education, to skills, let women have much more of an opportunity, break down barriers of patriarchy. I think that's the battle immediately ahead.
Thank you. And Emma?
So this is about the dystopia.
You can take on dystopia or UBI, or you can take on Nassim's questions if you like them.
No, I don't like them. I think again, when you look to the future is not preordained. It's up to us, it's up to the next generation to create the future, to create the world that we want to live in. So I urge everyone to participate, to join organizations, to mobilize, to be involved, and not just to sit on the sides and critique. It's much harder to be in the arena. It's very hard to be a leader, particularly at this current time, when in the information era anybody can tweet what they like and can criticize you. But you've got to have courage, you've got to stand up. We've got one world, we have one humanity. What divides us is very little. What unites us is much, much greater. So hope, not hate.
And Ha-Joon Chang.
Yeah, no, I'll say a few things about universal basic income. It has two versions. One is the Hayek-Friedman version, in which you are, as a citizen, given the minimum income and nothing else. And I think that version is very different from what some others are talking about, which is quite a higher level of income guaranteed and access to basic public service. Now, even on the, I have a problem with the first version. Even on the second version, I have some problems because, first of all, it delinks your existence with from work, and I think it's a serious issue. I mean, I cannot go into that, but it's something we need to seriously debate whether this is really a good thing. And secondly, also that I think the society has some right to kind of decide. I mean, what kind of services should be prioritized. I mean, I sympathize with the supporters of basic income in that, that this welfare bureaucracy has become too rigid and too uniform and too crushing. But, I don't think it's a right to go to the other extreme and say, well, here's your money, do whatever you want. Yeah?
Well, thank you. So we're now coming to the end of the session. I have to say you've been a great audience. Those were some fabulous questions. Thank you. And thank you, of course, to Nassim, Sadaf, Emma, Ha-Joon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Jaipur Literature Festival.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. A wonderful session. Thank you. Great way to end the day. Ladies and gentlemen, a quick reminder that we do have a music program at Clark Samir from 7 till 10 p.m. tonight, Bombay Basement and Inamoja. So please head down there to hear some wonderful international and local music. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow, 9 o'clock onwards, for another wonderful day of the 10th Z Jaipur Literature Festival. Have a great evening. Thank you.